The first miracle didn't look like a miracle at all. It looked like an old man standing by a dusty New Mexico road at dusk, staring down at a broken bobcat and wondering if it was already too late. Walter Hayes had lived out here a long time, long enough to know the way the desert goes quiet just before dark, how the light thins over the mesas and the shadows of the pinyon trees lean long across the sand, long enough to know when something isn't right. He'd only been driving that gravel stretch because he couldn't stand the silence in the house anymore. The little adobe place he'd shared with Eleanor felt too full of her and too empty of her at the same time. There are kinds of loneliness that don't have words. The kind that sits at your kitchen table with you, that follows you from room to room. That was the kind Walter carried. The shape on the roadside looked at first like just one more tumbleweed caught on a fence post, but as his headlights washed over it, he saw fur. Tawny, spotted, wrong. He hit the brakes harder than his knee liked and eased the truck onto the shoulder. The engine ticked as it cooled. The only other sound was the wind moving low through the sage. Walter stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, and walked toward the animal that should not have been lying so still in a place this open. It was a young bobcat, not much more than a bundle of muscle and bone, wrapped in a coat that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been streaked with dust and blood. One hind leg lay at an angle that made Walter wince. Its sides fluttered with shallow breaths, eyes half closed, but there, amber, reflecting just a slit of the fading light. For a heartbeat, he thought, I should leave it. Nature, circle of life. All the phrases people use so they don't have to feel too much. Then another thought came, quieter but heavier. Eleanor wouldn't have driven past. He crouched, his knees protesting, and spoke before he touched. Easy there, friend. Easy. His voice came out rough with disuse, but gentle. Hands that had once held Eleanor's in hospital rooms hovered over the bobcat's side, feeling for a breath, a flinch, any sign that this wasn't just a body on the roadside. The bobcat's ear twitched. A faint, almost soundless growl rose and died in its throat. There was fear there and pain, but also something else, pure fight, refusing to let go. Walter shrugged out of the denim jacket he wore even in September evenings, the one still faintly scented with cedar smoke from winters past. He wrapped the animal as best he could, trying to keep claws away from his skin, but knowing he'd take the scratches if they came. The fur was warm. Too warm, the way fever feels under a human hand. Inside the truck, he set the bundled bobcat carefully into an old dog crate that had been rusting in the back for years. Didn't think I'd ever use this again, he murmured. Guess we're both surprises tonight. He turned the key and pointed the truck toward the small wildlife rehab center 2 towns over. The road stretched ahead in a pale ribbon, dust kicking up in the side mirrors. He drove slower than usual, conscious of every bump. Every time the truck jolted, he whispered, Sorry, hang in there. There's a particular kind of silence that fills a cab on a night like that. Not empty. Thus, with emotions he hadn't let himself feel since Eleanor's last ambulance ride. Fear, tenderness, a strange, old-fashioned love for life itself. He wasn't thinking in big words like soulful or inspirational story. He was just an old man, trying to keep one small creature from slipping away. By the time he pulled into the gravel lot of the rehab center, the sky had gone dark. A single security light buzzed above the door. He'd called on the drive-in, so a tired woman in scrubs was already waiting with a rolling cart. Bobcat? She asked, peering into the crate. Her tone stayed professional, but her eyes softened. Hit by a truck, you said? Looked that way, Walter answered. His hands were shaking more now that the driving was over. Legs bad, still breathing. Didn't know what else to do. You did the right thing, she said simply. We'll see what we can do. No promises. These cases, she trailed off, letting the sentence hang instead of finishing it with the word everyone was thinking. Walter watched as they wheeled the crate inside, fluorescent light swallowing the bundle of fur and denim. For a second, the bobcat's eyes met his. Just a flicker. Wild, confused, but alive. Then the door shut. In the parking lot, the desert air felt cooler than before. A band of stars had come out over the low roofs of town. Walter stood by the open driver's side door, one hand on the metal, and let the weight of it settle in. He didn't know if the animal would make it through the night. He didn't know if he'd ever hear another word about it. The rehab center was always full, always struggling. Cases came and went. Names were written on whiteboards and erased. On the drive home, he told himself this was the end of it. A small act of kindness, nothing more. One of those moral stories real life sometimes gives us in miniature. A man sees a hurt creature. He stops. He helps. Then he goes back to his own quiet house. No fairy tales, no guarantees. Just doing the thing your heart won't let you walk away from. Back at the adobe, the silence hit harder than usual. He hung the denim jacket, now streaked with fur, on the back of a chair. The kitchen clock ticked too loudly. The chair across from him stayed empty, as it had for 3 years. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the table where he and Eleanor had once shared late-night coffee, looking about the world and the weather and whether the coyotes sounded closer that week. He thought of the bobcat's eyes, the way they'd opened for just a second in the truck's dim light. The way life hangs on sometimes by threads we can't see. "Won't see you again," he said aloud, mostly to convince himself. "You heal or you don't. Either way, that's the end of our story." He was wrong, of course, but that night, he believed it. He undressed, slowly, his knee aching, and slipped into bed with the familiar weight of solitude pressing down. Somewhere, out in the dark, coyotes called to one another. The wind moved sand against the stucco walls in a steady hush. In stories, we like to jump straight to the miracles, to the happy twist, but in real heartwarming stories, the ones that stay with us, there's almost always this part first. The part where someone does the right thing with no audience, no guarantee, and every reason to think nothing more will come of it. If you've ever made a small choice like that, checked on a neighbor, pulled over for a stray dog, picked up the phone when you really didn't feel like talking, you already know the feeling sitting in Walter's chest that night. A little sore, a little hopeful, mostly tired. He turned off the lamp. The room went dark around the framed photo of Eleanor on the dresser, her smile catching the last thin line of streetlight. Walter closed his eyes and listened to his own breathing. Steady, but not quite peaceful. Out beyond the porch, the desert held its own quiet stories, of animals that healed and animals that didn't, of tracks that faded and tracks that led back again. Walter didn't know it yet, but he had just stepped into one of those stories, the kind that would test his loyalty to a promise he'd made long ago and show him that love doesn't always look like what it used to. In the next part of this journey, we'll see what happens when the desert decides the story isn't over. When the bobcat he believed he'd lost finds its way back to his door. For now, if a part of you recognizes Walter's loneliness, stay with his tale a little longer. Let it keep you company. The second miracle also arrived quietly, not with trumpets or fireworks, just with the soft click of a pill bottle and a sound outside that didn't belong to an empty night. Summer slid into early fall over northern New Mexico. The sun started dropping faster behind the mesas, and Walter's days fell into a pattern that would have looked ordinary from the outside. He woke before dawn, made the same cup of instant coffee, and listened to the weather on the radio. He swept the adobe porch out of habit, more than need. Sometimes he drove into town for groceries and a polite 5-minute conversation with the cashier. Most days, he didn't speak out loud until evening, and even then, he was mostly talking to memories. The bobcat had been gone for months. No calls came from the rehab center, no updates. That's how those places work. They're too busy saving the next case to narrate how the last one ended. Walter told himself that was fine. He had done what he could. In his mind, the story was finished. A man rescued an injured bobcat and then let the wild take it from there. But the desert has its own way of circling back. One afternoon in late September, the air had that first faint edge of cool, the kind of day that used to make Eleanor pack a lunch and say, "Come on, we're not wasting this." The sky's too pretty to stay inside. The memory rose so clear it almost hurt. He could see her at their tiny kitchen counter years ago, slipping sandwiches into the old metal lunchbox, the one with a chipped red lid. "You talk more to rocks and rivers than to people," she'd teased, snapping the box shut. "Somebody has to make sure you remember to eat." Out in the desert that day, they had walked along the arroyo while cottonwood leaves rattled overhead. That had been a happy, ordinary moment. No grand speeches, no big decisions. Just two people who loved each other enough to keep showing up in small ways. Those are the pieces that stick. Later, much later, there was the hospital. The same hands that packed lunchboxes now thin and pale on the blanket. Machines hum softly around them. Walter is sitting in a hard plastic chair, tracing circles on her wrist with his thumb. "When I'm gone," she'd said, voice dry but steady, "promise me you'll still walk the land? Don't shut the sky out. Don't lock yourself away in that house." He'd promised. Of course he had. It felt back then like a promise made on another planet. Now, 3 years on, he realized how badly he'd broken it. Most days, he only walked from the porch to the mailbox and back again. That particular evening, he washed his dinner plate, set it in the rack, and looked at the small orange bottle by the sink. The sleeping pills. The doctor had called them a little help. Some nights, they were the only thing that turned his thoughts off long enough to rest. Another night, they left him foggy, like he was living underwater. His fingers closed around the bottle out of habit. He shook one pill into his palm. Tiny, harmless looking, a quiet way to not feel quite so much. Then he heard it. Not the wind, not a coyote. A short questioning sound from just beyond the front steps. A rough, almost chirping call that cut straight through the walls of the house and settled in his chest. He froze. There are moments when your body remembers before your mind does. His heart kicked. His breathing slowed. He set the pill back in the bottle, very carefully, as if any sudden move would break whatever thread had just been tugged. He opened the front door. The sky outside was deep blue, the last of the sunset fading behind the ridge. The porch light cast a small circle on the packed dirt, and at the very edge of that light, between the shadows of two low piñon trees, stood a bobcat. She was a learner now. The mess of blood and dust he remembered from the roadside was gone. One hind leg bore faint stiffness, but she stood on it. No crate, no bandages, just a wild animal, whole enough to move under her own power, looking straight at him. They stayed like that for a long breath. Man and bobcat. He didn't think Maple or any of the names from other heartwarming stories he'd heard. In that moment, she was just her, alive, present. A piece of the wild he'd once carried in his arms and then thought he'd never see again. "You made it," he said softly. The bobcat's ears flicked. She did not come closer. She didn't run either. She glanced past him toward the open doorway as if measuring distances, then back to his face. The scar on her leg caught the porch light for a second, a pale stripe against tawny fur, proof of pain lived through and survived. Walter felt something loosen in his chest. Not joy, exactly. Not yet. Something quieter. Relief. Gratitude. A reminder that love and loyalty don't always look like human relationships. Sometimes, loyalty is simply this: a creature that has every reason to avoid you choosing, for reasons you may never fully understand, to be near you again. He sat down slowly on the top step, careful not to advance even an inch. His knee ached as it bent. He placed his hands on his thighs so she could see them clearly. "I don't have anything for you tonight," he admitted. "No chicken, no fish, just me." The bobcat settled onto her haunches, tail curled around her paws, still at the safe edge of light. They watched the desert together as it cooled. A night breeze carried the scent of dust and creosote. A thin crescent moon lifted above the horizon. In that shared silence, a lot of emotions moved quietly through him. Guilt for how long he'd shut himself away. A soft, unexpected joy, like a shy animal stepping out from behind a rock. And underneath it all, something soulful and steady. The feeling that he was being given another chance, not just with the bobcat, but with the promise he'd made to Eleanor to keep living, not just surviving. Later, when he went back inside, he passed the pill bottle without touching it. He lay down in the dark, listening for every sound outside. Coyotes called. A truck passed far off. At some point, he thought he heard that gentle, wild chirp again. He slept through the night for the first time in weeks. Was it magic? No. This wasn't one of those shiny fairy tales where everything is fixed in an instant. His grief didn't vanish. The empty chair at the table didn't fill itself. But something subtle had shifted. The man who had let go on that roadside realized he hadn't just saved a bobcat once. That night, when the desert sent her back, it felt like she was returning the favor in her own way, nudging his heart a little more open, reminding him that connections can circle back when we least expect them. If you've ever had someone, or some animal, step back into your life after you were so sure that chapter was closed, you know how strange and sacred that can feel. It's not always loud. It's often small, but it lingers. And this was only the beginning. Because the real story isn't just that a man and a bobcat saw each other again. It's how, over time, they learned to share space, to trust, to respect each other's wildness and limits. How a wounded animal and a wounded heart slowly helped each other heal. In the next part, we'll sit with them as that fragile connection turns into a daily rhythm, a quiet companionship on the edge of the mesas, where kindness is measured in patient distance, and every small step closer feels like its own little miracle. For now, if some part of Walter's nights sounds familiar to you, keep walking with this story. Let it remind you that even in long, quiet seasons, something good might still be making its way back toward your doorstep. Some bridges aren't built with boards and nails. They're built one quiet step at a time. A man on a porch and a bobcat at the edge of the light, learning how not to be afraid of each other. After that first night, when the desert sent her back, the bobcat didn't come every evening. There were gaps. Days when the yard stayed empty, when only rabbit tracks stitched the sand. Then, just when Walter had convinced himself she was gone again, he'd catch that low, wild silhouette against the fading sky. He started with water, not food, not yet. Just an old metal bowl he filled each afternoon and set several yards out from the porch, where the earth sloped gently toward the arroyo. He didn't stand there and wait. He went back inside, turned on the radio, pretended to busy himself with dishes, and listened. Most evenings the pattern repeated. First, the rustle of brush, then a pause, long and cautious. Then the faint scrape of paws in the dirt as the bobcat circled downwind, testing the air, reading the story of his day and the smells that clung to the yard. From her side of this strange friendship, the world was all scent and sound and movement. She knew the shape of his footsteps now, the slower, uneven rhythm of an aging knee, the soft drag of his boot when he was tired. She knew when the house held only him, and when another human scent had lingered near the truck earlier. She knew the sharp tang of metal at the water dish and the warm dust where he'd sat on the steps. She stayed outside the ring of light, pupils wide, every muscle ready to spring away. Only when the house settled and the radio's murmur dropped did she pad forward, low and careful, to drink. Walter would watch through the screen door, not pushing, just present. Weeks went by. The water bowl became a routine, as familiar to him as his morning coffee. Some evenings he'd add a small scrap of leftover chicken or a bit of fish, not thrown toward her, not waved like a lure. He simply placed it beside the bowl and retreated. If you've ever earned the trust of a skittish dog or a barn cat that wasn't sure it wanted human hands near it, you know the rhythm. One step closer, 2 steps back. Patience instead of force. Kindness is measured in how much space you're willing to give. Walter began talking to her in that same soft, steady tone he'd once used on Eleanor in the hospital. when he changed bandages or adjusted pillows. "You're a smart girl," he'd say from the porch, keeping his eyes slightly averted so she didn't feel stared down. "Bobcats don't usually hang around folks like me. You're supposed to be up there in the rocks chasing jackrabbits, not listening to an old man ramble." Sometimes he'd share little bits of what he knew, half-remembered facts from a pamphlet at the ranger station, things he'd read years ago in a magazine. "They say your kind can roam miles in the day," he'd murmur. "They say you usually hunt alone. Keep your distance from people." "That's why whatever we're doing, it's unusual. I shouldn't make you too comfortable. Wild is wild. You've got to stay sharp out there." It wasn't a lecture, just an honest respect for who she really was. Not a pet, not a character out of fairy tales. A real bobcat with teeth and claws and a life that belonged to the mesas and the ravines, not to him. As they settled into this rhythm, something softened inside Walter too. On the nights when she came, he slept better. The ache of grief didn't disappear, but it shifted. Less like a raw wound, more like a scar, still tender if you pressed on it, but not all he could feel anymore. The presence of that wild animal on his property brought a strange kind of comfort, a reminder that he wasn't the only creature out here trying to heal from something. He decided she needed a name, not to own her, just to have a way to speak of her when he wrote to his niece, Lena, or when he talked to the empty chair across the table. One evening she appeared early, while there was still enough light to see the trees clearly. She paused near a twisted juniper, its dark branches framing her body like some quiet painting. Farther up the hill, the tall, straight forms of desert cedar stood against the sky, deep green even as the rest of the land turned gold. "Cedar," he said aloud, the word surprising him by how right it felt. "I'll call you Cedar. Strong, quiet. You bend in the wind, but you stay put." The bobcat flicked an ear as if catching the sound. For a brief second, Walter thought he saw a tiny relaxation in her shoulders, the slightest lowering of guard. Then she resumed drinking from the bowl, as if names were human business, not hers. Of course, grief doesn't move in a straight line. Even in a heart slowly waking up, there are bad days. One of those came in late fall. Walter had gotten a call from a friend back in town, news about someone else they knew who'd passed. Hospitals, funerals, paperwork, it all flooded back. By evening, his chest felt tight, his thoughts crowded. Cedar arrived as usual, the familiar silhouette at the edge of the yard, but this time, when Walter stepped out, he was less patient than he meant to be. He moved too quickly, frustration bleeding into his voice. "Well, there you are," he snapped, more sharply than he ever had. "You vanish for days, then show up like nothing's wrong." "Must be nice not to think about anything." Cedar froze. Her tail tip flicked once. The muscles along her back tightened. For the first time in weeks, she took a step backward instead of forward. The space between them widened by more than a few feet. It felt like miles. The words hung in the cooling air, sour and wrong the moment they left his mouth. Walter stopped, hand halfway to the doorframe. The anger wasn't really for her. It was for the losses he couldn't control, the people he couldn't save. But that's what happens sometimes when our emotions bottle up. We spill them where they don't belong. He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he said, voice softer now. "That wasn't fair." But Cedar was already melting into the mesquite shadows, leaving the water untouched. That night he didn't sleep well at all. He lay awake listening for her, hearing only the distant yips of coyotes and the restless shuffle of his own regret. The house felt lonelier than it had in months. The next evening he filled the water bowl again, even though part of him was sure she wouldn't come. He sat on the top step and waited anyway, the sky fading from blue to purple to ink. When she finally appeared, it was later than usual. She stayed farther back, just beyond where he could see her eyes clearly. The trust they'd built had taken a hit. But she hadn't disappeared completely. He stayed seated, kept his voice gentle. "I had a bad day," he admitted. "You didn't deserve that. You weren't the one I was angry at." He didn't reach for her. He didn't coax. He simply acknowledged his mistake and let the silence do the rest. Little by little, over nights and weeks, the distance shrank again, not to what it had been right away. Trust doesn't snap back like a rubber band, but bit by bit, Sita moved closer, until she was once more a quiet presence near his porch, a reminder that relationships, even between man and bobcat, are built on more than one good moment. They're built on apologies, patience, and a kind of loyalty that keeps showing up after the hard days too. If you've ever said something you didn't mean to someone, or some animal you cared about, you know that mix of shame and hope that comes afterward. You can't erase the hurt, but you can stack up enough kinder moments to outweigh it. This is what made their connection more than just an odd wildlife encounter. It started to look like the kind of heartwarming story that lingers, not because everything goes perfectly, but because both sides keep choosing to stay. And as this quiet bridge between grief and wildness was taking shape, the rest of the world was beginning to notice. Neighbors, rangers, people with their own worries and opinions about a bobcat sitting a little too close to a human home. In the next part, we'll see what happens when other eyes turn towards Cedar, when warnings, worries, and new voices step onto this fragile stage, and Walter has to balance his love for this wild visitor with his responsibility to let her stay truly wild. For now, if you're walking your own slow path of rebuilding trust with yourself, with life, with others, let this story remind you. Sometimes healing doesn't roar in. Sometimes it pads in softly on 4 careful feet, pauses at the edge of the light, and waits for you to meet it halfway. Some stories feel small until other eyes notice them. For a while, it was just one man, one bobcat, and a sun-baked porch. But the world beyond that porch was watching too. Word travels fast in a place where the nearest neighbor is still close enough to see the dust off your truck. It started with Ray. One afternoon, Walter was sitting on the steps, coffee mug warm in his hand, while Cedar rested a little way out in the yard. Not close enough to touch, close enough that you could feel her presence, like an extra heartbeat in the scene. The air was still, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts, until the crunch of tires on gravel broke it. Ray's pickup rolled into the driveway, bed stacked with firewood. He cut the engine, swung his door open, and hopped down, a cloud of dust puffing up around his boots. His greeting died halfway to his lips when he saw Cedar. Some instincts live deep in the bones of people who work the land. Ray's hand drifted toward the gun rack behind his seat before his mind caught up. "Walt?" he said carefully, not taking his eyes off the bobcat. "You know there's a cat in your yard?" Walter stood up slowly, putting himself just a little between Ray and Cedar without making a big show of it. "Yeah," he answered. "She's been visiting for a while now." "Visiting," Ray repeated, the word carrying a lot of doubt. "That's a bobcat. They hit goats, chickens, sometimes people if they lose their fear." Cedar stayed still, watching, tail tip barely moving. The air felt thinner for a second. Walter didn't argue facts. He didn't launch into speeches about love for animals or heartwarming stories. He just told the truth. "I found her hid by the road. Took her to rehab. They fixed her up, turned her loose. She came back on her own." He let that sit. "I don't feed her from my hand. I don't try to make her something she's not. She's wild. I know that." Ray looked from Walter to Cedar and back, torn between worry and curiosity. You could see it on his face. The tug of war between protecting what was his and recognizing the kindness in what he was seeing. "She ever come close to you?" he asked. "Closer than you'd expect. Not as close as a house cat," Walter said. "She's got more sense than that." For a long few moments, no one moved. Then Ray eased his hand away from the truck. "Just be careful," he muttered. "Wild's wild." He carried the wood to the side of the house, stacking it under the eaves. Cedar kept her distance, golden eyes following his path. When he drove away, the dust rose and settled. The yard felt changed, though nothing visible had moved. The story wasn't just Walter's anymore. Other lives were brushing up against it. Other fears. Other loyalties. A week or so later, an official-looking SUV pulled into the drive. Tan paint, state seal on the door. A ranger. Walter met her outside before she even reached the porch. She introduced herself as Ranger Kim Alvarez. Her voice was calm, her posture relaxed, but her eyes took everything in. The water bowl, the tracks in the dirt, the way Cedar's prints overlapped with Walter's boot marks. "We've had a couple of calls," she said, tipping her hat back slightly. "Neighbors are saying a bobcat is hanging around your place. You know anything about that?" Walter smiled faintly. "Depends which one you mean," he replied. "If she's got a scar on her back leg, I might." Ranger Alvarez didn't scold. She sat with him at the small picnic table by the side of the house, boots dusty from the road, the sun laying a warm bar of light across the table between them. "I'm not here to tell you you're a bad person," she said. "You did the right thing bringing her to rehab when she was hurt. That's an act of real kindness. Not everybody would stop." She let that land before she continued. "But I do need to talk to you about what happens next. Bobcats are shy by nature. They usually avoid people. When they start hanging around houses, it's often because someone's feeding them. And when a predator loses its fear, it's usually the animal that pays the price. Someone gets nervous and pulls a trigger." Part of Walter bristled. He loved Cedar, even if he hesitated to call it that. She had become a steady, soulful presence in his days. Hearing her mentioned as a predator instead of a miracle hurt a little. He stared down at his hands, working one thumb over the other. "I put out water," he admitted. "Sometimes scraps, not much." Ranger Alvarez nodded. "I get it. You're not the first. When you care about something, you want to take care of it." But with wildcats, the kindest thing can be to let them stay wild. Give water in a drought, sure. Get them help when they're injured. But regular feeding? She shook her head slightly. That's when they get into trouble. He sat with that in silence for a moment, looking out toward the low ridge where Cedar often appeared. "I don't want her hurt," he said finally. "I don't want to be the reason she gets too comfortable." The ranger softened. "Most folks I talk to about this get defensive. You're not. That tells me a lot." She stood, brushed the dust from her pant leg. "You can still enjoy seeing her. Just think of it like you're a good neighbor, not her provider. She knows how to hunt. Let her use that." After she drove away, the yard felt big and quiet again. The house looked smaller against the wide sky. Walter sat on the porch steps as the day cooled, turning the ranger's words over in his mind. His love for this bobcat wasn't a fairy tale. It had consequences. A man's loyalty can sometimes smother what he loves if he isn't careful. That evening, when Cedar appeared at her usual distance, he acted on that new understanding. He brought out the water bowl, set it in its familiar spot. But the scraps of meat stayed in the fridge. He sat on the steps, not calling, not coaxing, just sharing the air. "You've got rabbits and quail out there," he said quietly. "You don't need my leftovers." "I want you to make it, Cedar. Really make it." She moved in her usual slow circle, nose to the ground, reading the story of his day in the dust. Then she came to the water, drank, and slipped back into the shadows, muscles rippling under her coat. Wild, independent, still choosing to come. Over the next weeks, Walter's world continued to widen in ways he hadn't expected. Ray stopped by again, this time without reaching for the rifle. He and Walter worked side by side repairing a sagging section of fence, talking about a new set of vacation cabins going up down the road. More people, more lights at night where stars used to be. "A place like this used to feel endless," Ray said, wiping his brow. "Now it feels smaller." That comment stayed with Walter. The next time he walked the arroyo, he started picking up bits of trash, an old plastic bottle, a tangle of fishing line caught in a bush, a torn grocery bag fluttering like a strange desert flower. Not grand activism, just small acts of respect for the land that Cedar depended on. He wasn't marching or shouting. This wasn't that kind of inspirational story. It was quieter. One man, late in life, realizing the world outside his porch was bigger, more fragile, and more connected than he'd let himself think while he was drowning in grief. His kindness toward the bobcat was expanding into kindness toward the place they both called home. At night, he'd sit with the window cracked open, listening. Sometimes he heard Cedar's soft sounds as she passed by. Sometimes only the wind. Either way, he knew now that their story didn't exist in a bubble. There were neighbors, rangers, developers, hunters, rabbits, scrub jays, all part of the same web. If you've ever discovered that something you thought was just between you and it, a habit, a relationship, a private comfort, actually touches more lives than you realized, you know that mix of responsibility and gratitude. It can be sobering. It can also be strangely hopeful. It means your choices matter. For Walter, that realization was about to be tested in a new way. Because even as he tried to do right by Cedar, feeding less, watching more, respecting her wildness, there was a danger moving in the desert that had nothing to do with his porch, his water bowl, or his good intentions. In the next part, we'll step into one of the hardest nights of their story. The night Cedar came back, not just thirsty or curious, but torn and bleeding. And not alone. If you stayed with this tale because it touches some quiet place in you, keep listening. Sometimes the most powerful moral stories aren't loud at all. They unfold in whispers, in wounds, and in the way we show up for each other when the world turns harsh. Some nights split your life into before and after. For Walter, it happened on a cold wind, with the scrape of claws on concrete and a soft sound that did not belong to any happy ending he'd ever heard. Cedar had been coming less regularly as autumn deepened. Some weeks, she appeared 3 nights in a row. Others, the yard stayed empty, and only her tracks at the edge of the arroyo proved she was still out there, hunting, moving, living the wild life she was born to live. Water told himself that was good. The ranger was right. A bobcat should belong more to the mesas than to a man's porch. Still, when 2, then 3 evenings passed with no sign of her, an old ache stirred. It was the same tightness in his chest he'd felt waiting for test results years ago, listening for footsteps in hospital hallways that never came. On the 4th night, the sky turned the color of cooled ashes. A wind pushed thin dust across the yard. Walter almost skipped the water bowl, telling himself he shouldn't depend on seeing her. But habit, and something deeper, made him feel it anyway. He'd just turned to go back inside when he heard it. A low, broken chirp. Not the usual strong, questioning sound she made. This was thinner, ragged at the edges. He looked up. Cedar stood at the fence line, ribs heaving, one side of her body dark and slick in the porch light. The fur along her flank was clumped with blood. One ear looked torn. Her front paws planted wide as if bracing not just her own pain but something else. Behind her, half hidden by sagebrush, were 2 smaller shapes. At first, Walter thought they were rabbit carcasses she'd dragged in. Then one of them moved, a hesitant, shaky step forward, and he saw eyes, wide, frightened, the lean, too long look of young cats that had missed too many meals. Their coats carried spots and leggy grace that didn't belong to any barn kittens around here. Some mix of exotic breed and domestic, out of place in this rough country. Cedar glanced back at them, then forward at Walter, as if weighing some calculation only she understood. Every inch of her posture said she would fight if he came too close too fast. But there was something else in her eyes, too. A plea. He didn't waste time asking how or why. Sometimes, when emotions are running high, explanation can wait. Action can't. "Okay," he murmured, keeping his voice as steady as he could. "Okay, girl. Let's see what we can do." He opened the front door wide, moved slowly, keeping himself between Cedar and the darkness of the yard where coyotes might be listening. He fetched the old crate, the battered first aid kit and towels that once lived in a linen closet Eleanor had loved to keep tidy. It wasn't lost on him that he was repeating a scene from another life, kneeling beside someone hurt, hands moving on automatic, heart caught between fear and a stubborn, quiet love. These are the kinds of moral stories life writes with us when it thinks no one's watching. As he brought the crate to the porch, one of the small cats bolted sideways, claws scrambling on the concrete. The other pressed flat against the wall, eyes huge, fur standing up. Cedar's head snapped toward them, then back to him. She didn't growl. She simply stayed where she was, as if saying, "I'm here. I'm not running. Help them." Walter eased closer, talking softly, more for his own sake than theirs. "I see you," he whispered. "All three of you." Cedar let him touch her at last. Under the matted fur, the wound along her side was deep but clean, more like a rake of claws than a bite. He thought of traps, cages, panicked animals fighting for freedom. He didn't need the whole story yet to know it had been bad. He coaxed her into the kitchen, spread towels on the floor, and began to clean the wound with warm water, just as he had done the first time he found her. His hands moved gently, careful around the torn ear, the sticky fur. She flinched, muscles jumping, but did not pull away. The two smaller cats crept in behind her, drawn by the light and the smell of food he hadn't even set out yet. One of them, braver or hungrier, nosed toward the counter where a piece of fish sat defrosting. Walter reached out on instinct to stop it from knocking the plate to the floor. Tiny claws flashed faster than he expected, raking across the back of his hand. The sting was sharp. Reflex took over. "Hey!" he snapped, voice louder than anything that should be in a kitchen that calm. His hand jerked back. The kitten skittered under the table, tail puffed like a bottle brush. Cedar's head came up, ears flattening, eyes suddenly hot with alarm. For a second, the room held more than just injured bodies. It held fear, confusion, and old anger that had nothing to do with cats at all. The kind of emotions that live just under the skin when you've been through more than your heart knows how to carry. Walter froze, breathing hard, blood from the scratch running down his wrist into his sleeve. He saw Cedar's tension, the way her muscles lined up for a decision: protect, flee, or freeze. He made himself do the opposite of what the moment wanted. He lowered his voice. "I'm sorry," he said, words directed toward the table, the floor, the bobcat, and maybe himself. "That wasn't your fault, any of you." He ran his injured hand under the tap, watched the red swirl down the drain, and laughed once, short, tired, not quite happy, but real. "Guess we're all a little jumpy tonight." In that simple choice, something important happened. He chose love over pride, loyalty over the moment's flare of temper. Heartwarming stories don't come from never getting upset. They come from what you do after. Cedar's ears eased back to neutral. Her eyes stayed on him, but the readiness to fight softened into something closer to trust again. She let him return to his work, stitching where necessary, bandaging with strips of clean gauze. The kittens watched from a distance, shaking slightly but not running. By the time he finished, the clock over the stove said it was past midnight. He set out shallow dishes of food and water for the youngsters, gave Cedar a chance to rest in the warm kitchen, then eased open the back door. Instinct would pull her back to the dark, to the brush and the rocks. He wasn't trying to cage her, only to give her a pause before she went where he could not follow. After he finally lay down in his own bed, sleep didn't come easily. His mind replayed every detail: the torn ear, the way Cedar had looked back at the kittens, the scratch on his hand that already seemed less important than the questions humming in his chest. Who had done this? Where had those strange-looking kittens come from? What kind of person set traps big enough to catch a bobcat and a pair of domestic mix cats, then walked away? Morning answered some of those questions. With the first gray light, Walter followed Cedar's faint trail, a mix of hoof-like prints and small drops of dried blood out across the desert. His knee complained with every step, but he kept going. Loyalty will make you walk farther than you thought you could. About 2 miles from the house, In a narrow wash choked with tamarisk and trash, he found them. Metal cages, 3 of them. Doors bent, bars smeared with fur, a tangle of chain, a bucket kicked over on its side. The smell of fear still clung to the place. On one of the traps, scratched into the steel, was a name. Roy Maddox. Walter knew it. Everyone out here did. A man who liked to talk about rare pets and easy money, who always seemed to have more cash than his odd jobs explained. Walter lifted his phone, hands shaking for a different reason now, and took picture after picture. The cages, the name, the tufts of fur caught on the wire. Then he turned and made his way back to the truck, every step steady with purpose. When he sat across from Ranger Alvarez an hour later, sliding the phone across her desk, her jaw tightened as she scrolled through the images. "You did the right thing bringing me this," she said quietly. "Again." In that moment, Walter realized the night before had been bigger than one man and one bobcat. Cedar hadn't just come back for help. She'd led him to a wound in the desert itself, one that needed cleaning, not with bandages, but with truth. If you've ever had a moment when some small act of kindness unexpectedly shone a light on something much darker, an injustice, a pattern, a hurt bigger than your own, you know how humbling that feels. Like you've been invited into a bigger moral story than you meant to sign up for. For Walter, that story was just beginning to unfold. In the next part, we'll see how those 2 shaky kittens became part of his strange little family, and how Cedar's courage rippled out into decisions about legacy, responsibility, and what love looks like when you know your own time is limited. If some part of you is walking with Walter through that wash right now, feeling both anger and gratitude, stay with this tale. There is more kindness ahead than cruelty, more healing than harm, and a few more quiet miracles still making their way into the light. Some blessings arrive on 4 paws and a mess of chaos. The real surprise is not that they show up. It's how quickly you start worrying about what will happen to them when you're no longer here. After the night of the cages and the ranger and the bandages, the house did not go back to the way it was before. It couldn't. Cedar returned to the desert, her wounds cleaned and wrapped, the wild calling her back to the rocks and ravines. But the 2 young cats she'd brought to Walter's door stayed behind, at least for now. They paced the edges of the spare room at first, eyes big, tails low, unsure if this new place was another trap or a sanctuary. There was a cardboard box lined with towels, 2 mismatched bowls on the floor, and a folded blanket that still held a faint trace of Eleanor's lavender detergent. Walter sat on the hallway floor the first evening, just outside the doorway, talking more than touching. "I'm not much to look at," he told them, "but I can promise you this. No cages. Not here. Doors may close to keep you safe, but they're never going to lock." Over days, then weeks, fear unwound into curiosity. The bolder one ventured out first, a streak of spots and long legs skidding across the hallway like his paws were a little too big for the floor. The quieter one watched from the threshold, then slid along the wall, staying close to the shadows. When it came time to choose names, Walter didn't flip through a list or search online. He went somewhere older than that, back into a conversation at a kitchen table from what felt like another life. Years ago, he and Eleanor had sat with a pile of mail between them, talking about a cousin's new baby. Paper plates from dinner still sat on the counter. Somewhere in that easy, tired conversation, she'd laughed and said, "If we'd ever had boys, I like Harper and Scout. Strong, but gentle." They hadn't had boys. Life had taken them a different way. The names had just floated there, unclaimed, and then sank under the weight of other years. Now, standing in the hallway with 2 hungry, confused cats looking up at him, those names surfaced like something found at the bottom of a drawer. "All right," he said, voice thick with memory but warm. "You," he pointed to the wild, spinning one, "Harper. And you, with the quiet eyes, Scout." It felt, in a small, tender way, like he was finally letting those names be happy, even if the story looked nothing like the fairy tales they once imagined. These weren't children. This was not the life they'd thought they'd build. But love has a way of finding new shapes when the old ones are gone. Harper lived up to his name immediately. He turned the house into his territory of play, leaping at dust in a shaft of sunlight, sliding into chair legs, knocking a spoon off the table just to see it clatter. He brought a kind of noisy joy that Walter hadn't realized he missed. Scout became his shadow. In the evenings, when Walter settled into his chair with a book or a worn-out newspaper, Scout curled into the crook of his leg, like he was made to fit there. Soft purring filled the room like a small engine of contentment. These were the little heartwarming stories that made up Walter's days now. A bobcat who visited when she chose, and two odd-looking house cats who had somehow landed in the safest place they'd ever known. But with this happiness came a question that older hearts know all too well. It came in quietly, as most important questions do. One night, after laughing at Harper chasing his own tail in dizzy circles, Walter caught sight of himself in the darkened window. The man looking back had more lines than the one who'd driven Eleanor to the hospital, more gray at the temples, a stiffness in the way he stood. "What happens to you two?" he murmured, glancing down at Harper and Scout. "When I'm not around to fill the bowls." The thought stayed with him. It sat at his breakfast table the next morning. It rode beside him in the truck when he went for feed and flour. It walked with him to the mailbox and back, a steady companion. This is where a lot of real moral stories turn serious, where love shifts from just feeling to planning. Many of you listening know that shift. It's the moment you stop asking, "What do they bring to my life?" and start asking, "What will happen to them if I'm gone?" Walter acted on it. He drove into town and found his way to the small vet clinic by the highway, the one with the faded paw print sign. He had Harper and Scout checked over, shots, microchips, notes on their file that said in plain writing, "If something happens to me, call my niece, Lena." He left the clinic lighter in the wallet, but steadier in the heart. Later, he sat at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen that skipped on the first few strokes. He wrote a letter to Lena, the niece in Phoenix, who still sent birthday cards and holiday photos of her own grown kids. He told her about Cedar, about the night of the roadside, about the rehab and the quiet visits. He told her about the cages in the wash, about Roy Maddox and the ranger, about the two strange kittens who had become Harper and Scout. And then he asked, plainly but gently, if she would take them if he couldn't anymore. "I don't expect it," he wrote. "I know you have a full life already. But if you can find room, it would help me sleep more easily. They've given me more than I can say." He sealed the envelope with hands that shook, not from age this time, but from the vulnerability of hope. Days later, a letter came back in Lena's looping handwriting. "Uncle Walt," it said, "I had to read your letter twice. First to cry, then to smile." "Yes, of course I'll take them if you ever need me to. And also, I'd like to meet them before then, before the leaves turn, if we can swing it. I want to see this bobcat of yours too, even if it's from a safe distance." He pressed that letter to the table, eyes burning. The loyalty he felt to Cedar and to the kittens had just folded into another kind of love. The love between generations, between family members who sometimes drift but still care. That night, as the desert cooled, he stepped outside and lifted his face to a sky thick with stars. The air smelled of dust and sage. Somewhere out in the darkness, he guessed, Cedar prowled her territory, scarred but alive. He spoke softly, not quite a prayer, not quite a conversation. Something in between. "If someone is listening," he said, "I don't know why you sent a broken bobcat and two half-wild kittens to an old man who'd given up on being needed. But thank you for whatever this is, for the second chances, for the noise in the house again." He wasn't naming doctrines or quoting verses. He was just acknowledging what many of us quietly feel, that some connections are too precise, too healing to be pure accident. That sometimes life partners us with the exact animals or people we need to remember that love and kindness still exist. Cedar came that night, later than usual. She sat near the edge of the porch, listening as Harper thumped around inside and Scout purred in the window. Walter sat between them, a bridge the desert hadn't planned on, feeling more like part of a small, strange family than he had in years. If you've ever had a moment when joy was quickly followed by that question, what about after I'm gone? You know, this mix of sweetness and ache. Planning for that future doesn't diminish the present. It deepens it. It turns today's love into something durable. For Walter, that new steadiness was about to grow roots you could see. In the next part, we'll step closer to the little shelf by his front door, the place where Cedar's gifts, Lena's letters, and Eleanor's memory all come together into a quiet record of a life that has become fuller, not emptier, with age. If you're listening with your own "after I'm gone" questions tucked inside, stay with this story. There's comfort in watching someone else walk that road with courage, loyalty, and a heart that's learning, even late in the journey, how to stay open. Some love stories don't wear rings or hold hands. They sit quietly on a little shelf by the door, made of feathers, stones, and the memory of paw prints that grow lighter with time. It started with a stick. Not just any stick, a branch, really, straight as an arrow, smoothed on one side like something had worked at it over and over. Walter found it one morning, laid neatly on the front step, right where Cedar usually sat. No wind pattern could explain it. No kid had been by to play. It wasn't trash or something that had fallen at random. It was placed. He picked it up, turning it in his hands. The wood felt warm from the sun. On the smoothed side, he could see faint tooth marks. Not deep enough to gouge, but enough to say, "Someone carried me." Walter chuckled under his breath. "Well, thank you," he said to the open air. "Didn't think I was much for receiving presents from a bobcat." He carried it inside without really knowing why, and set it on the narrow table by the door, next to a small framed photo of Eleanor and an old ceramic dish where he kept his keys. It looked oddly at home there, like it had been waiting for a place to belong. That was the beginning of what he would later call the Cedar Shelf. The next gift came a few weeks later, after the Roy Maddox investigation had quietly gotten underway. Ranger Alvarez couldn't share every detail, but she did stop by one day to say that thanks to Walter's photos, there were no more legal excuses left for the man with the cages. "People like him," she said, "they think no one's paying attention. You proved otherwise. You and that bobcat of yours." That night, Walter stepped out to bring in the empty water bowl and saw it. A small, pale stone resting on the step. Not from his yard. The texture was different. The kind of smoothed shape that speaks of running water, creek beds, maybe miles away. Cedar lingered in the shadows, just beyond the circle of light, watching. He picked up the stone and felt the weight of it, not just in his hand, but in his chest. These weren't fairy tales with shiny crowns and castles. These were small, real-life miracles. A wounded bobcat rescued, 2 kittens saved from cages, a poacher finally held to account, and now a wild animal is leaving objects at his door, like a quiet thank you. He set the stone beside the branch. Over the months, the collection grew. A desert feather, black and white, that must have come from a scrub jay. A piece of glass worn soft and seafoam colored, maybe from some long broken bottle out in the wash. A tiny twist of driftwood that looked like it belonged on a beach, not in the mesas. Each time he found something new on the doorstep, he added it to the little arrangement. Eleanor's photo. Lena's most recent letter folded under a smooth rock. The odd gifts from Cedar. The shelf became a kind of altar to kindness and loyalty. Small proof that his life, even in its quietness, was touching other lives and other species. The community began to feel those ripples too. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the yard gold, a woman came up the path, her truck parked at the edge of the road. Walter recognized her, the neighbor whose dog had once limped home with a mangled paw from someone's trap. She held a pie tin in her hands, foil crinkling at the corners. "I heard," she said, by way of greeting, "about Maddox. About the cages." "Ranger Alvarez told me you were the one who brought in those pictures." Walter shifted, unused to praise. "Cedar led me there," he said. I just did the driving.
She smiled, eyes softening. Maybe, but you stopped. You didn't have to. She held out the pie. Thank you. For my sake. For the animals. For all of it. They sat on the porch steps, sharing slices with paper plates balanced on their knees, along about with Ether and grandkids, and the feeling of hearing coyotes without immediately thinking of traps. Cedar watched from under a low branch, only her eyes catching the light. Later, Ray showed up with leftover planks from a fence job. "Figure your steps could use some shoring up," he said, studying the worn boards where Cedar liked to sit. "Wouldn't want your visitor putting a paw through." As they worked, sweating a little in the late morning sun, Ray admitted, half under his breath, "House got real quiet after my kids moved out. I give you a hard time about that cat, but I'll tell you, it's something, knowing there's still wild things close enough to see." The bobcat had gone from threat to neighbor in his language. That was no small shift. These were the ripples. A ranger, a little less discouraged about her fight against poaching. A neighbor is a little less alone in her worry. A man like Ray is a little more open to seeing a predator as part of the landscape, not just an enemy. Walter's odd, heartwarming story was quietly expanding the circle of who people felt responsible for. And through it all, Cedar's visits changed in their own way. As the seasons turned, her paw prints around the house grew fewer. Sometimes a week passed without a sign, sometimes two. Walter learned not to panic. Her absence meant she was doing what bobcats are meant to do, ranging farther, teaching herself new hunting grounds, maybe even raising young somewhere out there in the folds of the land. He still set out water in dry spells, less out of habit now and more out of respect. He still checked the step each morning, not because he expected gifts, but because noticing had become part of his daily kindness. The same way some people check in on a neighbor with a quick phone call. Some mornings, the step was bare. Other mornings, there'd be a new addition, a seed pod that had no business in his yard, a knotted bit of root shaped like a question mark. Each item joined the others on the cedar shelf, and each time he placed something there, he felt a calm, quiet emotion settle over him, a mix of gratitude and something almost like reverence. You could say this was just a man assigning meaning to random debris. But if you've ever kept a box of little things from your own life, a ticket stub, a river rock from a trip, a note in someone's handwriting, you know that objects can carry a kind of soulful weight. They anchor the big, intangible feelings in something you can touch. That's what the cedar shelf became. A physical record of a story that had changed him. Not an inspirational story in the flashy sense, a simple one, about love that crosses species, about loyalty that keeps showing up, about emotions that soften instead of harden with age. One afternoon, as he dusted the shelf, Harper twined through his ankles and Scout hopped up onto the nearby chair, watching. Walter picked up the stone, the feather, the branch, one by one, and spoke to the empty room, to Eleanor's picture, to the bobcat who might be miles away but never really gone from his mind. "Look at this," he said softly. "Look what we've been given. A life that felt over. And then this." He didn't say, happy ending. Life rarely wraps itself that neatly. What he had now felt better than that word anyway. It was something quieter and sturdier, a sense that even as footprints faded in the sand, the impact of those paws, that kindness, would last. Visits from Cedar grew rare enough that each one felt like a holiday. Sometimes she appeared at dusk, just long enough to drink and sit for a few minutes in her old spot, listening to the muffled thumps of Harper's antics inside. Sometimes Walter only knew she'd been there from a fresh track and a new object on the step. He missed the regularity of her company, of course, but there was no bitterness. The love he felt for her was big enough to accept her wildness, to understand that real loyalty doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means knowing when to go. If you've ever watched someone, or some animal you care about, slowly step into a life that takes them farther from you, and felt both sadness and a great, strange pride. You know the mix of emotions sitting on that porch with Walter in the late light. His world had grown larger than one man and one grief. It now held neighbors, rangers, 2 rambunctious cats, and a wild bobcat whose path crossed his just often enough to remind him that connection doesn't end when daily contact does. And all of that, every visit, every letter from Lena, every gift on the step, was about to find its way onto paper. In the final part of this story, we'll sit at the kitchen table with Walter as he starts to write it all down. The man, the bobcat, the miracles that never asked to be called miracles. We'll see how turning a life into words becomes its own kind of gift. Not just to him, but to anyone who needs a reminder that kindness, love, and hope still move quietly through this world. If your own shelf of memories has been stirring while you listen, stones, notes, photos, little things that matter more than they look, stay with us. The last chapter isn't about saying goodbye. It's about how we choose to remember, and how those memories can keep us and others warm long after the footprints fade. The last miracle didn't look like lightning from the sky. It looked like an old notebook on a kitchen table, a pen that sometimes shook, and an old man deciding his story might be worth leaving behind. By the time Walter finally sat down to write it all out, the house felt different than it had been 3 years earlier. The silence was no longer a heavy thing pressing on his chest. It was a gentle space, shared with small sounds. Harper launching himself at a crumpled paper ball, Scout purring steady as a clock, the soft clink of his mug as you set it by the cedar shelf. Outside, the desert went on the way it always had. Wind in the sage, distant coyotes, stars bright enough to make you feel both small and held. On the table in front of him lay the pieces of his life. Lena's latest letter, reading glasses, a folded list from the vet, the photograph of Eleanor he'd kept close through every season. And now, a blank first page. He touched the pen to the paper and paused. Where do you begin a story like this? At night, he found a wounded bobcat on the roadside, with the 3 winters of grief before that, when he wasn't sure he wanted to keep waking up. With Harper and Scout tumbling into his life like 2 clumsy miracles on long legs. In the end, he started simply. My name is Walter Hayes, he wrote, speaking the words in his mind as if reading them to an unseen friend. I never planned on becoming the man who rescued a bobcat. I never planned on her coming back either. The pages filled more slowly than a movie montage, more honestly than most fairy tales. He wrote about the scent of dust and blood on the night air, the feel of Cedar's heartbeat under his hands, the quiet loyalty in the way she kept returning from the wild. He wrote about kindness that showed up in surprising places, in Ranger Alvarez's steady voice, in Ray bringing lumber instead of a rifle, in a neighbor's pie left on the porch as a thank you. He didn't make himself the hero. If anything, he underlined the moments he had failed, snapping at Cedar on a bad grief day, raising his voice at a scratched hand, nearly reaching for a sleeping pill instead of sitting with his own emotions. Those too belonged in any honest collection of moral stories. Harper tried to help, of course. At one point, he sprawled right across the notebook, smearing ink with a careless tail. Scout curled against Walter's thigh, offering warmth more than advice. All 3 of them were part of this heartwarming story, whether they knew it or not. When his hand grew tired, Walter would set the pen down and look over at the cedar shelf. Each object had become its own chapter heading in his mind. The smoothed branch for the first time Cedar chose to stay. The pale stone for the day they exposed Roy. Maddox's cages. The feather for the afternoon he realized his little acts of love were rippling into the wider community. The sea-worn glass for the quiet, soulful hope that maybe, just maybe, none of this was random. He didn't call any of it a miracle on the page. That word felt too big and too loud. Instead, he counted them in smaller ways. Nights slept without medication, letters from Lena that sounded more like sharing than worrying, laughter that came easier, like a creek unblocking after a long drought. If someone picked up these pages one day, he wanted them to see real life as it is, messy, tender,
surprising, an inspirational story. Not because everything went perfectly, but because love and loyalty kept showing up anyway. Between species, between neighbors, between generations. One evening, as the sun slid down behind the ridge and painted the mesas copper, he stepped outside with the notebook in hand. He read a few lines aloud into the cooling air, voice low and steady. The night on the road, the first return, the ranger's warning, the decision to let Sita stay truly wild even as he loved her. "If this reaches anyone," he said softly, "I hope it reminds them that life doesn't end when it breaks. Sometimes it begins again, on 4 paws." Somewhere beyond the yard, a bobcat chirped. It might have been Sita. It might have been one of her young, now claiming their own territory. Either way, the sound fit into the story like it had been waiting for its cue. For the first time, he imagined someone else hearing this tale. Maybe Lena, sitting at her own table in Phoenix. Maybe a stranger far away who knew what it was to lose someone. And then slowly, quietly, find reasons to be happy again. He hoped they would feel less alone, more connected to the wild kindness that still moves through this world in fur and feather and human hands. That was the fresh perspective writing gave him. His life wasn't just something he was enduring. It had become a thread in a much larger pattern of love between people and animals, between grief and healing, between the seen and the unseen. A bobcat had walked through his days and left more than paw prints. She'd left a way for him to turn his pain into something gentle and useful, a story that could offer comfort to someone he would never meet. So he kept writing. Not every day, not with perfect sentences, just honestly, carefully, with the same patience he had once used to sit on the porch and wait for Cedar to decide if she trusted him. In the end, the notebook sat beside the cedar shelf like one more gift, pages and paw prints on the same wall. When you and I share this kind of story, we're really doing the same thing Walter did. We're turning small, quiet acts of love into something that might outlive us, something that can carry hope into someone else's dark season. Before we close, I'd like to invite you to turn the camera gently back toward your own life for a moment. Is there a cedar in your story, an animal, a person, a place that showed up when you felt most empty and helped you remember love, kindness, or simple loyalty again? Maybe it was a bobcat, maybe a dog or a neighbor, maybe a patch of woods that felt like a friend. Let that come to mind. Let yourself feel a little gratitude for it. If this journey with Walter and Cedar touched something tender in you, if these heartwarming stories and quiet moral threads give you a bit more hope, we'd be grateful if you'd tap like and subscribe. It's a small gesture, but it helps this kind of gentle, soulful storytelling reach more people who might need it. And if you feel called to go one step further, you can use the Super Thanks button or donate through the link in the description. Your support helps real rescuers and rehab centers care for injured wild animals like bobcats, giving them another chance to heal and, if they're lucky, to leave their own miracles in paw prints, in gifts, and in the lives they quietly change.